Kyle Owens built his company from the ground up, but lately, something felt off. Sales were steady, yet customer complaints had increased. Employee turnover was higher than ever, and when he asked his district managers why, they fed him the same excuses: people just don't want to work anymore. Kyle wasn't buying it. His business had expanded to 9 locations and he had prided himself on treating employees well, but something was broken and he needed to see it for himself. So he made a decision. He'd go undercover. Kyle had never personally met most of the employees at the store level. He trusted his managers to do their jobs, but maybe that was his mistake. He had hired a professional makeup artist to age him up, making him look about 20 years older with graying hair, wrinkles, and a slight limp. He dressed in second-hand clothes, wore thick glasses, and applied for a janitorial position at one of his locations under the name Ken Owens. When he arrived for his first shift, the store manager, a man named Rick, barely looked at him. "Janitor, right?" Rick muttered, flipping through some paperwork. "Mops in the back, clean the bathrooms first." Kyle nodded, keeping his head down. No introduction, no welcome, just orders. As he moved through the store, pushing a mop and emptying trash cans, he kept his ears open. The employees were overworked. There were only 3 people handling the lunch rush when there should have been at least 6. A young cashier, Brianna, looked exhausted as she rang up customers, while a cook in the back named Lewis was sweating heavily from trying to handle all the orders alone. "Rick, we need another person on the line," Brianna called. Rick rolled his eyes from his perch near the register, sipping a soda. "Figure it out." Kyle clenched his jaw. That was the first red flag. An hour later, he took a break in the employee cafeteria. He grabbed a simple sandwich from the vending machine and sat at a corner table alone. Employees came in and out, chatting with each other. No one paid him any attention. Then, someone did. An older janitor, probably in his late 50s, walked in, carrying his lunch in a paper bag. He scanned the room, then approached Kyle's table. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice kind. Kyle shook his head. "Go ahead." The man sat down and unwrapped his sandwich. He took a bite, then glanced at Kyle's uniform. "New guy," Kyle nodded. "Yeah. Just started today." "I'm George," the janitor said, offering a handshake. Kyle shook it. "Been working here for 10 years. Never seen you before. They transfer you from another store." Kyle hesitated, but then nodded. "Something like that." George studied him for a moment, then chuckled. "You don't talk much, huh? That's all right. Just know this place, it's not what it used to be. Used to feel like family, not anymore." That caught Kyle's attention. "What changed?" George sighed. "Management. They stopped caring. Good workers quit. The ones who stay get treated like machines." "And Rick, he only looks out for himself." Kyle frowned. "That bad?" George nodded. "Worse. But hey, you'll see for yourself soon enough." Kyle didn't respond, but inside his frustration grew. He had trusted his managers to maintain the culture he had built. If George was right, they had failed him, and he was going to find out just how deep the problem went. Kyle finished his sandwich, his mind racing. George's words lingered. This wasn't just a case of 1 or 2 lazy employees, this was deeper. A broken culture, neglect. A failure of leadership, including his own. He had been too distant for too long. George ate in silence for a moment, then glanced up. "You got kids?" Kyle hesitated, then nodded. "2, grown now." George nodded like he understood something unspoken. "That's good." "Family's everything." He folded the wrapper from his sandwich neatly. "You ever work a job like this before?" Kyle chose his words carefully. "Not exactly, but I've been around long enough to know when people aren't happy." George sighed, rubbing his hands together. "Yeah. That's the truth." He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "Look, I don't know you, but I'll tell you this: keep your head down. Don't push too hard. Rick, he doesn't like people who ask questions. You cross him, he'll find a way to make your life miserable." Kyle didn't react outwardly, but inside he was taking notes. Rick wasn't just lazy, he was actively making things worse. That meant fear kept people in line. That meant employees didn't feel safe speaking up. That meant Kyle had a real problem. Before he could respond, the break room door swung open. Rick stood in the doorway, arms crossed. His gaze swept the room before landing on Kyle and George. "You two done with your little lunch date?" His tone was mocking, dismissive. "Trash is piling up." "Let's go, Grandpa." George didn't react, just crumpled his paper bag, stood up, and nodded at Kyle before walking out. Kyle followed, gripping the mop handle tighter than necessary. The rest of the shift, he observed everything. Employees worked at a frantic pace, clearly understaffed. Customers waited longer than they should have, growing frustrated. Instead of stepping in to help, Rick stayed near the front, watching but doing nothing. At one point, Brianna, the exhausted cashier, dropped a cup of soda while trying to juggle multiple drink orders. The liquid splashed across the counter and onto the floor. Rick's response was immediate. "Clean that up," he barked without looking away from his phone. Kyle was already moving, mop in hand. As he wiped up the sticky mess, he noticed Brianna's hands shaking slightly as she tried to prepare another drink. "You all right?" he asked quietly. She nodded too quickly. "Yeah, just long day." It was more than that. She was overwhelmed and no one seemed to care. Later in the storage room, he found George wiping down shelves. Kyle leaned against the mop handle. "Tell me more about Rick." George didn't look up. "What's there to tell? He does whatever he wants, cuts hours, then complains when we can't keep up, treats people like dirt. But the higher-ups don't notice or they don't care." Kyle's jaw tightened. "What about you? Why stay?" George wiped his hands on a rag, exhaling slowly. "I got a granddaughter. She's 9. My daughter, her mom, she's between jobs. I help out where I can." "Can't afford to just walk away." Kyle nodded. That was what kept people stuck: responsibility. Fear. A loud crash echoed from the front of the store. Kyle and George exchanged a glance before moving toward the noise. Near the register, Lewis, the cook, was on the floor, gripping his wrist. A tray of food lay scattered beside him. Rick stood over him, arms crossed. "Get up." Lewis winced, trying to push himself up with his good hand. Brianna knelt beside him. "I think he's hurt." Rick scoffed. "He's fine, just clumsy." Kyle stepped forward before he could stop himself. "He should sit down." Rick's eyes snapped to him, narrowing. "Who asked you?" Kyle ignored him and crouched beside Lewis. "What happened?" Lewis swallowed hard. "Burned my wrist earlier, didn't say anything, then I slipped." Kyle glanced at the injury. The skin was red and blistered. "You need to get that looked at," Kyle said. Rick rolled his eyes. "He's not going anywhere, we're already short-staffed." Kyle stood slowly, meeting Rick's gaze. "You'd rather have an injured worker in the kitchen than let him take care of himself." Rick's expression darkened. "You don't get paid to have opinions, Janitor." Kyle held his ground. The tension in the room was thick. Employees had stopped what they were doing, watching. Then George stepped forward. "He's right. Lewis needs a break." Rick's lips curled slightly, but before he could respond, a voice cut in. "If he's not getting medical attention, I'm calling corporate." "Brianna." Rick turned on her. "Excuse me?" She stood straight, her voice steadier than before. "You heard me." Kyle saw it then, the moment Rick realized he had lost control of the room. Employees were watching, waiting. Rick scoffed. "Fine, go, but don't expect special treatment when you come back." Lewis didn't wait for permission. He walked toward the back and Brianna followed. Rick turned back to Kyle. "You're on thin ice, old man." Kyle said nothing, but inside he knew. Rick's time was running out. Kyle didn't sleep much that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling of his hotel room, running through everything he had seen. The exhaustion in Brianna's face. The burn on Lewis's wrist. George carrying more weight on his shoulders than anyone should at his age. And Rick, the man who was supposed to be leading, doing nothing but making it worse. He had built this company to be different. Now it was just another place where people dreaded coming to work. The next morning, he arrived early, blending in with the quiet hum of the store as it opened. The air smelled of fresh coffee and fried food. Employees trickled in, rubbing sleep from their eyes, preparing for another long day. George was already at work, wiping down tables in the dining area. Kyle grabbed a rag and started helping. "You don't have to do that," George said, glancing over. "Figured I'd make myself useful," Kyle replied. George nodded, accepting the help. The two worked in silence for a while before George spoke again. "Rick's got it out for you now," he said, keeping his voice low. Kyle met his gaze. "I noticed. He's the type that doesn't forget. You stood up to him yesterday. That means today he's gonna push back." Kyle had no doubt about that. As if on cue, Rick's voice cut through the air from behind them. "Ken, my office, now." Kyle set the rag down and followed him. The office was small, cluttered with paperwork, an old computer, and a stack of unopened supply boxes shoved in the corner. Rick leaned against the desk, arms crossed. "You think you're smart?" Rick asked, eyes cold. Kyle didn't respond. "You've been here, what, 2 days? And already you're sticking your nose where it doesn't belong," Rick continued. "I don't care where you worked before, but in this store I run things, not you." Kyle met his stare evenly. "I wasn't trying to step on toes, just helping where I could," Rick scoffed. "Helping? You embarrass me in front of my staff." Kyle kept his voice measured. "Lewis was hurt. He needed medical attention." Rick pushed off the desk, taking a step forward. "You don't get to decide that, I do." Kyle held his ground. "And what if he had gotten worse? What if he had passed out in the kitchen? You'd be dealing with more than just an embarrassment." Rick's eyes darkened. "You don't get it, do you? This place runs because I make the tough calls. If I let every little problem slow us down, we'd never get through the day." Kyle studied him. He wasn't just lazy. He believed what he was saying. He thought he was doing what was necessary. Kyle didn't argue. He had seen enough. Rick grabbed a clipboard from the desk and shoved it into Kyle's hands. "You're on bathroom duty all day. Since you like helping so much, you can spend your shift scrubbing toilets." Kyle took the clipboard without a word. The test was obvious. Rick wanted to humiliate him, break him down. But Kyle had built this company from nothing. He wasn't about to be rattled by a man like Rick. He spent the next few hours cleaning, but he didn't stop observing. He saw Brianna handling the morning rush alone again, her movements stiff with exhaustion. Lewis hadn't returned yet. George moved slower than usual, rubbing his lower back when he thought no one was looking. By lunchtime, Kyle had made up his mind. He found Brianna near the soda machine refilling cups. "You okay?" he asked. She startled slightly before nodding. "Yeah, just tired." He waited a beat before speaking again. "Why do you stay?" She hesitated, then sighed. "I don't have a choice. I need the money. College isn't cheap." Kyle nodded. "If you could change one thing about this place, what would it be?" She glanced around, as if making sure no one was listening. "Respect," she said quietly. "No one here feels valued. We work hard, but it never matters. People quit and no one cares. Rick treats us like we're disposable." Kyle felt the weight of her words. He found George next, near the back storage area. "Got a second?" Kyle asked. George wiped his hands on his apron. "What's on your mind?" Kyle hesitated. "If someone higher up actually listened, what would you say?" George chuckled, shaking his head. "I'd say it's too late. People like Rick don't change, and the people above him, they don't see what happens down here." Kyle met his gaze. "What if they did?" George studied him for a long moment. "Then I'd tell them to clean house. Get rid of the rot before it spreads any further." Kyle exhaled slowly. It was time. He stepped out of the storage room and walked straight to the front of the store. Employees were scattered around, working, moving quickly. Rick stood near the register, scrolling through his phone. Kyle stopped in the middle of the dining area and pulled off his glasses, then his wig. The room went silent. Rick looked up, confused at first, then his face paled. Brianna gasped. George, standing near the back, dropped the rag he had been holding. Kyle took a deep breath and spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm Kyle Owens," he said, voice steady, "and this company is mine." The silence in the restaurant was thick. Employees stood frozen, their eyes fixed on Kyle, their boss, the man they had unknowingly worked alongside for days. Rick's grip tightened around his phone, his face shifting from pale shock to something darker. Kyle let the moment stretch, watching the realization settle over the staff. Then he turned his focus to Rick, his voice steady as he spoke. "I've spent the last few days seeing how my company actually runs when I'm not around, and what I saw was unacceptable." Rick's jaw clenched. "This isn't the place for this conversation." Kyle stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. No, Rick, this is exactly the place, right here in front of the people you've been mistreating. Brianna glanced at George, uncertainty flickering in her eyes. Employees shifted, some exchanging glances, others waiting to see what would happen next. Rick straightened, forcing a laugh that didn't quite land. Look, I don't know what you think you saw, but running a store isn't easy. We're short-staffed. These kids don't want to work. I do what I have to do to keep this place running. Kyle's expression didn't change. That's your excuse. That's why Lewis had to work through an injury. Why Brianna is handling more than she should. Why George, a man who's been here for years, still has to warn new hires to stay quiet or risk your retaliation. Rick's confidence wavered for the first time. His eyes darted to the employees watching, then back to Kyle. You don't understand what it's like on the ground. You sit in an office while we're out here dealing with real problems. Kyle took another step closer, lowering his voice just enough to make Rick lean in. I built this company from nothing. I scrubbed floors, handled customers, worked night shifts. Don't stand there and tell me I don't know what it's like. Rick tried to regain control, his voice sharpening. You think you can just walk in here and judge my decisions? You don't deal with the daily pressure, you don't have to make the calls I do. Kyle's eyes darkened. Your job was to lead, to support your team, not to break them. Rick's mouth opened, but Kyle cut him off with a sharp shake of his head. You're done here, Kyle said. Pack your things. Rick's face twisted, his composure cracking. You can't just fire me on the spot. Kyle's voice never wavered. I can, and I just did. The weight of those words settled over the room. Employees held their breath, waiting for Rick's reaction. For a moment, he looked like he might argue, but then his shoulders tensed. He set his jaw, shoving his phone into his pocket. You'll regret this, Rick muttered before turning sharply and walking toward the back office. Kyle exhaled, then turned to the employees. Their faces were a mixture of shock, relief, and uncertainty. This isn't just about Rick, Kyle continued, his voice carrying through the space. It's about all of you, the way you've been treated, the conditions you've been working under. That changes today. Brianna blinked as if processing his words. What does that mean? Kyle looked around the room, meeting each employee's gaze. It means from now on you will be treated with the respect you deserve, you'll have the support you need. No more being overworked and ignored. George, arms crossed, studied him. And how do we know things won't just go back to the way they were once you leave? Kyle nodded, respecting the skepticism. Because I'm not leaving this store the way I found it. I'll be making immediate changes, starting with promoting leadership that actually cares about the people working here. Brianna hesitated. Like who? Kyle let a small smile break through for the first time. George. The older man's eyes widened slightly. Me? You've been here for years, Kyle said. You care about the people here, you know what this place needs. George shook his head. I'm just a janitor. Kyle met his gaze. No, George, you're a leader. You've been watching over this place longer than anyone. It's about time you have the authority to make real changes. The employees murmured among themselves, the energy in the room shifting. George ran a hand over his chin, considering, then he exhaled, nodding slowly. All right, if it means making this place better, I'm in. Kyle turned to Brianna. And you've shown resilience even when things were stacked against you. I want you in a leadership role too. Brianna's lips parted in disbelief. Me? You see the problems firsthand, Kyle said, and you're not afraid to speak up when it matters. That's the kind of leadership this store needs. She swallowed hard, then smiled. I won't let you down, Kyle nodded. I know. Lewis returned just as the conversation settled. His wrist was wrapped in bandages and he looked around, confused by the strange energy in the room. What did I miss? He asked. Brianna grinned. Everything. Kyle turned to the rest of the staff. From now on, things will be different. I'll be implementing changes across all locations, making sure no store is ever run the way this one was again. The employees exchanged looks, a mixture of hope and disbelief. Then, slowly, one by one, they started to clap. It wasn't just about the firing of Rick. It was about the shift, the acknowledgement that they mattered. Kyle looked around, feeling something settle in his chest. He had come undercover to find out what was wrong with his company. Now he was walking away knowing exactly how to fix it. As the applause faded, Kyle took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on his shoulders. The employees had seen a glimpse of change, but trust wasn't built in a single afternoon. He had made promises, and now he had to prove he would keep them. He walked toward the back office where Rick was gathering his things. The man was shoving papers into a worn-out briefcase, his movements stiff with anger. Kyle leaned against the doorframe, watching him for a moment before speaking. "You had a choice," Kyle said. "You could have led with integrity. Instead, you used your position to make things easier for yourself and harder for everyone else." Rick didn't look up. "Spare me the lecture. You think replacing me is going to fix everything? Good luck. These people will walk all over you the second you start giving them what they want." Kyle folded his arms. "You never understood leadership. It's not about control, it's about trust, and you lost theirs a long time ago." Rick let out a hollow laugh. "Trust doesn't keep a business running. Hard decisions do." Kyle studied him for a moment. "Hard decisions don't mean mistreating people. You could have built something strong here, but instead you made yourself the problem." Rick slammed his briefcase shut. "You're making a mistake." Kyle didn't break eye contact. "No. The mistake was letting someone like you run this place for as long as I did." Rick picked up his things and brushed past him without another word. The door swung shut behind him, leaving a heavy silence in the office. Kyle exhaled and turned back toward the store. Employees were still standing around, some whispering to one another, others cautiously returning to their work. He needed to reinforce the message. This wasn't just about removing Rick. It was about making real, lasting change. He walked up to George, who was still processing everything. The older man met his gaze, his expression unreadable. "You really meant what you said?" George asked, his voice quieter than before. Kyle nodded. "Every word." George wiped his hands on his apron, thinking, "If I'm stepping into this role, I need to do it right. That means making sure these people don't just hear promises but see results." Kyle smiled slightly. "That's exactly why I picked you." George nodded, rubbing his chin. "First thing pay. People aren't going to stay if they're being stretched thin without fair compensation." Kyle had already considered it. "I've been reviewing wages across all locations. That's going to change starting here. No more skeleton crews because we're too cheap to pay for extra hands." Brianna, who had been listening nearby, stepped forward. "And scheduling. We need more structure. People are burning out because shifts are unpredictable and we're always short-staffed." Kyle turned to her. "What would you change?" She hesitated, then squared her shoulders. "Set schedules. If someone needs time off, have a system in place so we're not scrambling last minute. And cross-train more employees so no one person is doing the job of three." Kyle nodded. "Make a list of what you'd need to make that happen. I'll make sure you have the resources." Lewis, who had just returned, joined them. "Kitchen equipment needs upgrades. Some of it barely works, and we waste time fighting with it instead of getting orders out." Kyle took mental notes. "Send me a full report. If something needs replacing, it gets replaced." The employees exchanged glances, the skepticism still present but beginning to shift. They had heard promises before, but this was different. Kyle wasn't just talking, he was taking action immediately. George crossed his arms. "And what about the other stores? If this was happening here, it's probably happening elsewhere." Kyle's expression hardened. "I'm going to every location myself. No more trusting reports from people who have their own interests in mind. I need to see what's really going on." Brianna nodded approvingly. "That's how we know you're serious." Kyle looked around at the employees. "This is just the start. I won't be able to fix everything overnight, but you have my word this company is going to be what it was meant to be. A place where people want to work, not one they have to escape from." The energy in the store shifted again. Employees straightened their shoulders a little more, whispered conversations turned into focused discussions. The change wasn't just in words, it was in the way they carried themselves now. Kyle turned back to George. "You ready to lead?" George exhaled, then nodded. Yeah, let's do this right. Kyle extended his hand. George shook it firmly. The work had just begun. But for the first time in a long time, Kyle knew his company was on the right path.